Hey everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of a brand new series called RetroBreak's Experience Boost. In this series, I'm going to be sharing some of the most interesting retro games from my collection, as well as a few fun facts to go along with them. So let's get started with the first game here, which is Daikatana for the Game Boy Color. And I included this one in my previous video, which was my top 20 Game Boy Color games, Game Boy Color exclusive games. And the reason I'm sharing this again is because I feel like it is such a unique and interesting game for the system, mostly because this is one of the few examples where the downscaled port, the sort of portable version of the bigger home console game, is actually better than the game that came before it. So in this case, this game was outsourced to a Japanese developer, and they were told to make the game like The Legend of Zelda, and John Romero basically just reviewed the script and made sure that it fit his vision. Obviously he was the producer and the designer of the full-featured console and PC game, which did very badly reviews-wise, but this game on the other hand did very well reviews-wise, and it is well regarded as one of the best games on the system, so really interesting game. Don't overlook it if you were kind of put off of Daikatana, because the Game Boy Color version is definitely worth playing. Next up here on the stack is a game called Dwice for the PC, and this was released in 2006. And the reason that this game is so interesting is because it's actually one of many, surprisingly, games that were actually developed by Alexei Pajitnov, who is the original creator of Tetris. And it even says right there at the bottom of the box, from the creator of Tetris, and I'm sure you can tell just by looking at this that it is very similar. It basically has the same kind of blocks, although the actual gameplay itself is very different. And I also just loved this era of PC games. I have a lot of really fond memories of playing e-games and all the various different collections. This game, in fact, is actually quite fun to play, if a little bit simple. So basically you've got a well full of blocks, kind of like Tetris, except the blocks are already there, and they actually start filling up from the bottom as you're going along. And basically all you need to do is select two of the same shaped block in order to remove them from the playfield and clear up the queue, because if anything goes off the bottom then you lose. You also get bonus points if you manage to connect two of the same colour and shape, which obviously is a little bit more tricky to do in some situations. And of course, as the game progresses, the level starts moving faster and faster. There's also a bunch of different items you can find in the stages to help you clear away the blocks faster too. And it includes a story mode and an arcade mode, and it is just a great puzzle game. And I find it really fascinating to take a look at all of these other games that Alexei made after Tetris, and I'll definitely be showing more of them in the future. But that was Dwice. Definitely check it out if you can, and it still seems to run fine on modern PCs as well, which is great. Now, I've been wanting an excuse to talk about the Gizmondo again for a long time, and the game that I've chosen to talk about, in this episode at least, is SSX3, the Gizmondo port. I say port, but basically it's a completely original game, and it was so impressive for the system. I'd played the Game Boy Advance version of SSX3 at that point, but this version just blows it clean out of the water. The Gizmondo is actually a very, very capable machine. It basically feels like a PlayStation 1 game. It has that sort of graphic style and that sort of frame rate, and it even has like full-blown proper soundtrack as well, not like the Game Boy Advance one. So there is just so much going for this. And in fact, as a kid, or as a teenager I guess when this came out, I actually played this version of SSX3 so much that I actually 100% completed it. And I'm probably one of the only people in the UK, perhaps even the world, that has actually played the game all the way through till completion, and it really is a great game. Don't overlook it just because the Gizmondo is kind of a failed handheld. I had a great time with this. And with the Gizmondo being one of the worst selling consoles of all time as well, this might actually be one of the rarest games that I own, so that's another really cool thing about this, and I'm definitely going to be talking more about the Gizmondo in the future as well, because I really do think it deserves more love. It was very misunderstood at the time. And in case you were curious, before we move on, the Gizmondo games are actually just SD cards, and they come in that inside the box. And I've also got a demo card there and a random SD card that I had filled with games too. I used to love playing the Gizmondo at college. I had it filled with different emulators and all the Gizmondo games basically. I downloaded the entire set of games for the entire library and put them all on an SD card. I really loved playing Carmageddon on there too. Anyway, I'm getting carried away. I'm going to save the Gizmondo for a future video. Next is another very rare game. In fact, it's probably rarer than SSX3. This one is called World Reborn, and this was a re-release by Pico Interactive. This was actually a cancelled game for the Game Boy Advance that was originally supposed to come out in 2003, but the developer couldn't find a publisher all the way up until 2015 when Pico ended up publishing it themselves. So this is kind of an official release and kind of a reproduction version of a game, but it is a great game actually. It's kind of a mix of an RPG, a story-driven game with kind of visual novel style elements, and a horizontal scrolling shooter complete with like experience points and a leveling up system and loads of levels spanning across this big world map and really cool boss fights and great graphics, and it would have done really well if it did come out at the time, I think. So it's such a shame that it never got an official release, but it's great that Pico picked it up, and also you can actually get the ROM online, actually officially by the developer themselves, which is really cool, and I wish more people would do that. And I actually feel really bad for the developers. They were called Neopong, and after this GBA one got cancelled, they were actually working on a sequel for the DS, which also got cancelled, and I don't know whether that one's online anywhere. Let me know in the comments if it is. Anyway, World Reborn is a great game for the system, and if you have a way of checking it out, definitely do so. Now next isn't really an interesting game as such, but it's one of my all-time favourites. It's the original Donkey Kong Country, and the reason I chose to include this game is because recently it was the game's 30th anniversary, and I was very lucky to actually meet some of the original creators of the game. I got to meet Greg Mayles and Steve Mayles, as well as David Wise and Kev Bayliss, and I got to meet them all in person, and I had a great conversation with them. I also got to see a panel that they did earlier in the day where they talked about the development of the game, and there was one thing from that that really caught my eye and caught my attention, and it's the fact that the minecart levels in this game were actually originally going to be a lot more challenging and a lot more involved gameplay wise than they are in the final game. You'd have to do things like slowing down or speeding up the cart or lean side to side to try and make it over certain gaps and dips in the rails and things, and if you did any of those things wrong, then the minecart would just crash or fall off the tracks and you would fall into a pit and have to restart. So they're already the most frustrating levels in the game, but can you imagine if they added all of these extra mechanics on top? It would have just been insane. But even so, it's one of the best games ever made, and although the sequels are also really good, I still recommend playing the original one first and then going through the trilogy, and in fact I've been thinking about streaming them again whenever I get back up and running on Twitch, so let me know if that's something you'd like to see in the future. This one's a really fun one, and the reason I chose this is because it was actually the inspiration for my own game that I made a few years back called Super Doughnuts. This game is called Kururin Doughnuts Okashi Recipe, at least I believe that's what it's called anyway. The game itself is really fun. You basically use the touchscreen to roll the donut around, and the faster that you swipe on the donut on the touchscreen, the faster you roll around the stages, and you can jump up and smash through blocks and get different power-ups as you're going, and there's a little like Mario 3 style world map that you have to explore as well. And when I actually played this originally, I didn't own the physical version, I just had it downloaded onto an M3 card, so I'm really happy to finally own a proper physical copy of the game that inspired me so much all those years ago. And yes, don't worry, Super Doughnuts is coming back at some point next year, I promise. I'm about 80% of the way through rebuilding it now for the PC, and there's not that much more left to go. Alright, next up here we have The Apprentice for the Philips CDI. And the CDI in general is just such a unique and interesting console. It's not a very good console, and the majority of the games play like absolute rubbish on there, but this is one of the few exceptions. The Apprentice is actually a really good 2D platformer. It has really nice animation and graphics, as you can see, and the gameplay itself is really fun too. It's very challenging, especially if you don't have the proper controller for the system, which thankfully now I actually do, so I can enjoy it a little bit more. I actually made a video about this game before, maybe about 10 years ago, when I was doing a series called Retro Game a Week. And for the longest time I could not understand why that was my most popular one of those videos. Well, it turns out that I did a little bit of digging about why this video was getting so popular compared to all the other ones. Apparently there's a cheat in this game where you can make all of the girls naked, and everyone just came to the video hoping to see the girls naked in the video, and they were very disappointed when they found out that I didn't know that such a cheat existed. So if you are interested in a little bit of a naughty game for the Philips CDI, definitely check out The Apprentice. It is a really good game too. It just so happens that perhaps the artists were feeling a little bit horny that day. Next we have a really cool RPG for the SNES by my favourite game developers, Quintet. The game is called Robotrek, and this one's interesting for a few reasons. First of all, it's actually a very similar style of game to something like Pokemon, where you go around collecting different robots to fight in battles. Before I even knew who Quintet was, I was always fascinated that a game like this existed all the way back in 1994, and it's a great game too, and I've never actually finished it, so I need to change that one day. The other reason that I wanted to include this is just because of how wildly different the North American box art is compared to the Japanese box art. This is the same game. You would not know that looking at these two boxes. In Japan, the game's called Slapstick, and it's a very cartoony anime style. And then in the West, we got it as Robotrek, which is like a really super serious sci-fi style box. So to see the two side by side is just kind of hilarious. But it's a great game either way. Definitely check it out if you like Pokemon and you want to check out something kind of similar on the Super Nintendo, complete with amazing music, graphics, characters, the whole lot. You really can't go far wrong with Robotrek. Now the next games are actually 3 different games, and I included them because they're all part of the same series, and this is actually a fan series. So the Toho project, which is the game that these games were based on, is kind of an open license for people to do whatever they want with, basically, within reason. There's like terms and conditions. The main Toho games are shoot 'em ups, which I'll probably cover in a future video. But these 3 here, these were made by fans, and these are actually Toho games styled after the original Mega Man series, and I really love all 3 of these. It took a lot of trial and error to get them working on the computer, but I'm very happy to have them all physically. And it's just so cool to experience like retro-inspired, modern, Japanese indie games based on Toho, which is one of my favourite franchises. So really cool to have all these. They're called Rock Maiden, by the way. And here's the 3 of them. And I actually got them earlier this year, I think, because a Japanese shipping company actually sponsored one of my videos. So technically I got these for free because they gave me some shopping money to spend on the site. So I definitely picked something really cool. And I would love to talk about the Toho series in more detail in the future. There's so much that I want to go into. So maybe in 2025 you'll hear some more about it. And going from talking about a game based on a shoot 'em up to one of my favourite shoot 'em ups of all time, this is Raiden, the original Raiden, on the PC Engine in particular. This, in my opinion, is the best shoot 'em up on the system and the best version of Raiden 1. You can hear it rattling around inside because, if you don't know, PC Engine games came on these tiny little card chip style things, and they just sit in there. They're supposed to have a little protective piece of plastic, but clearly that's gone missing. But anyway, the game is absolutely incredible. When I first got my PC Engine back in 2014, I think, in Japan, I got this game with it as well, and I actually plugged it in the hotel room, and every single night after we'd come back from a day out, I would put Raiden on and I would play through the entire game, or as far as I could. And by this point I've pretty much memorised the entire game off by heart, and I absolutely love it. And there was actually a second version of Raiden for the PC Engine as well, for the PC Engine CD, called Super Raiden, which actually improved a few things and it gave it proper CD quality audio, but they did for some reason reduce the difficulty level, so I've never enjoyed that one quite as much as the original here on the HuCard. It's kind of a shame that Raiden 2 never came out on the PC Engine either, because I love playing that one on Raiden Project for the PS1. But I would love to be able to play it on the PC Engine with that perfect controller and the turbo fire and everything. It just is the best way to play the game in my opinion, and what an amazing game it is too. Now this next game is a really weird one. This is called Opoona, and it was released on the Wii in 2008. It's a very interesting kind of RPG where you're basically starting a new life on this random planet that you crash landed on, and you're trying to find the rest of your family and get back to your spaceship. And the game mostly takes place in these sort of enclosed areas, and it's a very, very strange game, but the reason I included it on my EXP list to begin with is even more unusual than the game and the graphics, is the control scheme. You can actually play this entire game one-handed using nothing but the nunchuck, and I always thought at the time that was really interesting, and it was kind of a selling point for the game. Not that it really makes that much difference gameplay-wise, but it's cool that they thought about it, and they even say on the back of the box, simple one-handed controls. At the time, I remember reading that a lot of people kind of thought of this as sort of the Wii's version of Earthbound, which is kind of a quirky, modern-day take on the RPG formula, although this one's clearly set in the far future. It kind of reminds me of like what a Pikmin RPG might be like, because the little guy there reminds me a little bit of Olimar. Anyway, really cool game for the system. Check it out if you want a very unique RPG. Next, like the Gizmondo game earlier, I thought I would include another random handheld console, this time the Nokia N-Gage, and quite an interesting game for that system too. This is SonicN. The N standing for N-Gage, I presume. This is basically a really bad port, actually, of Sonic Advance 1. And I included this one just for the novelty's sake, really, more than anything, because it really is not a version of Sonic that you would ever choose to play if you had the choice. It's basically Sonic Advance 1, but worse in every way possible. The frame rate's worse, the resolution is much worse. You basically have two bad options. You can either play it using the entire N-Gage screen, which basically just shrinks the display sideways, so you've basically got a really thin kind of portrait view of the game, or you can press one of the buttons to shrink the entire screen down into the same aspect ratio as it would be on the Game Boy Advance, but obviously missing a lot of pixels, so it looks really pixelated and really bad. And not only that, but the frame rate is nowhere near as smooth as it is on the GBA either. Add to that the fact that you have to use the really small and awkward D-pad and one of the number keys to jump, and it's just a recipe for disaster. But it's an interesting concept for the time, and it was a little bit ahead of its time in terms of having full-featured games available on mobile phones. And just like the Gizmondo as well, and like a lot of these other handhelds from the early 2000s, the games actually just come on weirdly customized SD cards, basically. And that's what the inside of an N-Gage case looks like, in case you were wondering. But I do not recommend you try this one, honestly, unless you're just morbidly curious like I was. Now for a really fun game for the Famicom Disk System, another really rare and unusual console. And I'll show you the discs for the Disk System, because they're really unique as well. They're bright yellow, they're kind of like floppy disks, but they have a bit of a different layout, and they don't have the magnetic thing to pull along the side, but that's what they look like. They also have side A and side B, so when the game's loading you have to turn it around and load the other half. The game in question though, Otocky, I think that's how you pronounce it, is basically one of the first ever rhythm games where they mixed the music and the rhythm with the gameplay itself. So the game is basically a horizontal scrolling shooter, but you shoot in time with the music, and depending on what direction you shoot, it actually shoots out a different pitch, a different music note basically, and you kill all the enemies and you get to the end, and then you have to fight a giant music note before you move on to the next level. It's very simple, but it's very unique, and actually if you play it right, the soundtrack can actually be quite good too, so definitely one of the most interesting games in my collection, I think. Next is PLOK, which is one of my favourite platformers for the Super Nintendo, and one of my favourite games of all time actually. It's probably my second favourite platformer on the SNES after Donkey Kong Country 2. It's just an incredible game all around. It has some of the best music of the entire generation in my opinion. The gameplay is really fun as well. It starts off very simple with just basic linear levels, and it progressively gets more and more complicated as the game goes on. There's big open levels where you have to find fleas and kill a certain number of them in order to move on to the next stage. And it also has a really fun sense of humour as well. It's very British humour, which I really appreciate in games like this. And the interesting fact that I have to go alongside this fantastic game is the fact that it was actually a sequel to a cancelled arcade game called Flea Pit, and you can actually read about this cancelled game and see some of the assets that were used in the game on this website that I'm putting over the screen right now, so definitely check it out. I'll put a link in the description if you're curious. And there was also talk for the longest time of a follow-up to this game for the N64, which never came to fruition, and I'm very sad because this is such a unique one-off game. And there was a follow-up comic series, but I really wish there was more playable stuff in the PLOK universe. The closest thing to PLOK, I would say, in the modern era is probably Cuphead, and I think the developers did get some inspiration from this game, because it does feel very similar, especially in terms of its difficulty and its boss fights. It's such a great game. If you've got a SNES, you need to play PLOK. Now for the Nintendo Puzzle Collection for the GameCube. This is a Japanese exclusive game that included 3 classic Nintendo puzzle games. You have Dr. Mario, you have Panel de Pon, and you have Yoshi's Cookie. All 3 of them are fantastic puzzle games that all play quite differently from each other. In Dr. Mario, it basically plays like the American version of Tetris 2, where you have to match the blocks in order to make things disappear from the screen, and it's kind of already pre-populated and you need to clear out all the germs. That one's really fun. Panel de Pon is also known outside of Japan as Tetris Attack, which is the game where you swap the 2 different blocks around, also known as Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, which was an amazing game on the N64. One of my favourite puzzle series of all time. Absolutely love Panel de Pon in all of its various forms throughout the years. And Yoshi's Cookie is interesting in particular because the puzzles in Yoshi's Cookie were actually designed by Alexei Pajitnov himself. So basically all 3 of these games have some Tetris DNA and heritage in them, which is really cool. And the other cool thing about this, the Japanese version, is the fact that in here it also came with the connection there for the Game Boy Advance. So this was one of the first examples of you being able to take the games off the console, transfer them onto the handheld and actually play the same games on the go. And it's basically a precursor to what the Switch would become, so it's so cool. And there was actually going to be an American release of this game, but it got cancelled at the last minute. And again, you can visit a website and see some of the cancelled assets for the game, including English versions of the title screen and descriptions about all the games too. So it's so sad that this never came out outside of Japan because they are fantastic games, and to have them on the GameCube as well would have been really great. Next, I decided to check out another really cool and obscure system, this time the Vectrex, and one of the best games for the Vectrex, in my opinion, is Scramble. This version of Scramble came out in 1982, which was 1 year after the original arcade release, and it's a great port as well, and obviously on the Vectrex it looks incredible, and the camera can't do it any justice. It's basically a precursor to Gradius, which obviously became one of Konami's most well-known and long-running franchises. It's so cool to see where the series got its start, and it was also one of the first ever horizontal scrolling shoot-em-ups where the level actually scrolls instead of you moving it like you used to do in something like Defender, which came out around the same time. And it's also one of the biggest games on the Vectrex too, with multiple different levels and a proper kind of feeling of progression, whereas a lot of them were more like single screen puzzle kind of games. So such an awesome game, such an awesome version for the Vectrex too. And I would love to do more about the Vectrex in the future. It's just a shame that it's something that you really need to experience in person, really. Now for another really cool system that I own, this time for the Nintendo Virtual Boy. And this is actually a system that I haven't done a video on just yet because, kind of like the Vectrex, but to a much more extreme degree, it's basically impossible to capture any Virtual Boy footage using the actual hardware, which I would really like to try and do. Vertical Force is basically a really cool vertical scrolling shoot 'em up, and it's great to have that kind of traditional game for the system as well. As much as I love the into-the-screen cool gameplay of Red Alarm, it kind of feels a little bit gimmicky, whereas Vertical Force basically feels like an offshoot of Hudson's Star Soldier series, which are some of my favourite games on the PC Engine. For the longest time, I think people actually thought this was part of the same series because it's by the same developers, but they've kind of said that it's something completely separate. And the interesting thing about this game in particular is the fact that it still does use the Virtual Boy's 3D display to a really cool effect. Basically, the game plays on 2 different layers, and you can press a button to either move into the background or up into the foreground, and you can actually see some enemies flying underneath you in 3D, so you don't need to worry about them. It's a really cool effect, and there's kind of 3D parts of the level that go past as well. Obviously, it's impossible to show on camera, or in fact on any 2D display, but if you've got a way of playing Virtual Boy games, definitely check this one out. And there are actually some really good ways of playing Virtual Boy today, including a really good emulator for the 3DS if you've got a hacked 3DS. And there's also an emulator available for VR headsets as well, which is also really cool and probably the best way to play the games today because you still get that really immersive feeling when you're playing them. And it's so cool to experience what kind of primitive VR there was around in the 90s. And some of the games for the Virtual Boy are really good. Anyway, I'll save it for my full Virtual Boy episode. Let's move on to the next game. Now for a PC game, and I don't really cover PC games that much on the channel, but I would love to try and get more into them. This is a game that I discovered a few years ago now at Play Expo. The game is called Screamer 2, and it quickly became my absolute favourite retro PC racing game. The driving physics and the controls on the keyboard for this game are just absolutely fantastic. And I loved getting it in this big box as well, because I had a load of these growing up as a kid, and they were all completely unnecessary because inside you still just get the regular CD tray anyway, and you get a giant instruction manual for some reason. That's just how PC games were back then, or sometimes they would just house a floppy disk and nothing more, but they would be in massive cases like this, which are really cool to collect, and I love seeing them in game shops and things. The game itself though is absolutely amazing, and the best thing is that it's actually still available to play on modern PCs using Steam or good old games, so definitely check it out. The prequel as well, Screamer, the original Screamer, was also fairly good. It's kind of like a PC take on Ridge Racer, but it's nowhere near as good as the sequel. They just absolutely perfected it. And the interesting fact about this is that the developer for this game, called Milestone, actually still makes racing games for the PC today. In fact, since this game came out in 1996, they've basically produced a brand new racing game every single year. And I think it would be really interesting one day to sit down and play all of their racing games across the years and actually see kind of how the engine that they used for this game kind of evolved over the years, or whether they changed to use a different engine and a different physics system and things. I think it would be really cool, so let me know if you've played any of Milestone's more modern games and how they stack up to this absolute masterpiece here. This game here is basically two games in one. It's Space Invasion and Karate Joe, and the interesting thing, well, actually there's a few interesting things about this one. First of all, it was given away for free in a gaming magazine. In this case, the magazine was actually called G-Force, which was the follow-up to my favourite Game Boy and Game Boy Advance magazine called GBX. I didn't actually get this one back in the day because I actually had a subscription, and this was actually given away after that magazine had closed down and merged with the other G-Force magazine, basically. And the other interesting thing is the fact that all of these games were unlicensed. They were unlicensed by Daytel, but you could actually buy them in shops in the UK. You could buy them in game, and you could buy them in HMV as well. And I did do a full video about the entire range of these Daytel games. They were all published under a brand called Rocket, which were basically owned by Daytel. It's a really weird story, and I went into it in loads of detail back then, so I'll link that video down below and at the end of this one. Definitely check it out if you want some really fascinating history into the Game Boy and some of the weird licensing issues that were going on around the time as well. Both of these games though are actually really fun, and Space Invasion in particular has an incredible soundtrack too. And the final game for this episode of RetroBreak's Experience Boost is the original TrackMania, and I'm a massive fan of TrackMania. This is the first one that I ever played, way back in 2004 now. I actually had a demo for the game before I actually played this, which I got at a game show called GameStars Live, which was also the first time I got to see the DS in person too, before it was officially released. The game is absolutely amazing. I remember just staying up every single night as a kid, but our computer couldn't run it, so I had to play it at my nan's house. And I just absolutely loved it, especially on this desert level here, just doing all of the loop-the-loops and the crazy stunts and tricks. And my fun fact for this game is the fact that when I actually made my TrackMania retrospective a few years ago, the designer and the developer for the original game actually watched that video and told me how much he enjoyed it, and childhood me would just not believe that for a second, so that just made me so happy. It's honestly one of the best things that's ever happened to me since I started doing YouTube videos, so just thank you so much for making such an incredible game series that's still going strong today. I really hope you enjoyed taking a look at such a wide range of games across a variety of different consoles. And this idea actually came from something that I've been doing over on Blue Sky, where every single day, so far at least, I've been posting one of these games along with a fun fact. So if you follow me over on Blue Sky, I would really appreciate that, and you can keep up with these every single day, and then when I've built up enough, I'll come back on YouTube and make another one of these episodes. So that's it for episode 1. Thank you so much for watching, and I think I'll link you to the TrackMania video that I made that I just mentioned, so enjoy that, and I'll see you all again very soon. Goodbye.